Imagine thousands of military officers simply disappearing. Then, years later, hidden graves are discovered beneath a forest. Deep inside the Katyn forest near Smolensk, German soldiers made a discovery that would become one of the greatest historical controversies of the Second World War. Beneath the pine trees lay thousands of bodies. The victims were Polish military officers. Many still wore their uniforms. Some carried letters, family photographs, rosaries, or diaries that had remained untouched since the day they died. Almost every man had been killed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. The discovery shocked the world. But instead of providing answers, it created a mystery. Nazi Germany accused the Soviet Union of carrying out the executions in 1940. The Soviet Union responded by claiming Germany had committed the crime after invading the area in 1941. Each government blamed the other. Each claimed the evidence proved its case. For decades, millions of people were left wondering who was telling the truth. The victims were more than soldiers. They included doctors, professors, engineers, judges, police officers, and military commanders, the very people who represented Poland's leadership before the war. Nearly 22,000 of them had disappeared without explanation. Their families waited years for answers. Many never lived to hear the truth. To understand why these men were buried beneath a silent forest, we must return to 1939, when Poland became trapped between two dictators who had already decided its fate. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, beginning the Second World War. For more than 2 weeks, Polish forces resisted despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Then, on September 17th, a second invasion began from the east. The Soviet Red Army crossed the Polish border. Only weeks earlier, Germany and the Soviet Union had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Hidden within its secret protocol was the fate of Poland. Before the fighting had even begun, the country had already been marked for partition. Caught between two powerful armies, Poland collapsed within weeks. Germany occupied the west. The Soviet Union occupied the east. As Soviet forces advanced, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, began arresting thousands of Polish military personnel. But these prisoners were unlike those captured in most wars. Many were reserve officers who, in civilian life, had been teachers, lawyers, engineers, doctors, judges, professors, and public officials. Alongside career officers and police commanders, they represented much of Poland's educated leadership. To Soviet authorities, these men were not simply prisoners of war. They were individuals capable of rebuilding an independent Poland in the future. The prisoners were transported to 3 main NKVD camps: Kozłsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. Although separated by hundreds of miles, they shared the same uncertainty. Life in the camps settled into a routine. The prisoners attended roll calls, exchanged news, wrote letters home, and tried to maintain hope. Many believed they would eventually be exchanged or released once the war stabilized. Back in occupied Poland, their families believed the same. Letters became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. Months passed with no explanation. Parents searched for information. Wives waited for news. Children continued asking when their fathers would return. No one outside the Soviet leadership knew that the prisoners' fate was no longer being decided by camp commanders. Inside the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Politburo were preparing a decision that would permanently alter the lives of thousands of families. The men held inside those camps still believed they had a future. In reality, that future had already been decided. As winter turned to spring in 1940, life inside the Soviet prison camps remained uncertain but orderly. The prisoners followed daily routines, wrote letters when permitted, and discussed rumors of a possible exchange. Many believed that, as officers captured during a conventional war, they would eventually be released. They had no reason to believe otherwise. What they could not see was that their fate was no longer being decided by military commanders. It was being decided inside the Kremlin. To Joseph Stalin and the Soviet leadership, these prisoners represented far more than a defeated army. Many were experienced officers, police commanders, judges, professors, doctors, engineers, and civil servants. If Poland were ever restored as an independent nation, these were the men most likely to rebuild its military, government, and institutions. The Soviet leadership viewed them as potential enemies of the state. In early March 1940, Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD, submitted a proposal to the Soviet Politburo. The document described the prisoners as hardened and uncompromising enemies of Soviet authority and recommended that their cases be handled through a special procedure without trials. On March 5, 1940, Joseph Stalin and other senior members of the Politburo approved the proposal. According to the historical documents later released by the Russian government, the order authorized the execution of nearly 22,000 Polish military officers, police officials, and members of Poland's educated elite held in Soviet custody. There would be no court proceedings, no formal charges, no opportunity to defend themselves. The decision was classified as a state secret. From that moment, thousands of prisoners who believed they were waiting for release had unknowingly been condemned to death. The NKVD immediately began preparing for an operation unlike any it had carried out before. Lists were finalized, transportation schedules organized, execution sites selected, and burial pits prepared in advance. Meanwhile, nothing appeared to change inside the camps. The prisoners continued reading, talking, praying, and planning for a future that no longer existed. Soon, the guards would begin calling their names. Most believed they were leaving for another camp. Instead, they were beginning the final journey of their lives. In early April 1940, the routine inside the camps suddenly changed. Small groups of prisoners were ordered to gather their belongings and prepare for transfer. The announcements sounded ordinary. After months of uncertainty, many believed they were finally being moved toward release or exchange. Some shook hands with friends they expected to see again after the war. They never did. Prisoners from Kozylsk were transported toward the Katyn forest near Smolensk. Those held at Starobelsk and Ostashkov were taken to separate NKVD execution sites near Kharkiv and Kalinin, now known as Tver. Although the destinations differed, the operation followed the same carefully planned procedure. Upon arrival, each prisoner was processed individually. Their identity was confirmed. Personal records were checked. Then they were led away from the others. According to the historical record, NKVD execution teams killed the prisoners with a single shot to the back of the head. The operation was overseen by senior NKVD personnel, including Vasily Blokhin, whose name has become closely associated with the executions. The source material also notes that German-made Walther pistols were used during the killings, a detail that later became part of the international dispute over responsibility. The executions continued day after day. As each group was killed, trucks carried the bodies to prepared mass graves hidden beneath the forests. The victims were buried in long trenches, their personal belongings often left with them. Once the graves were filled, they were covered with earth and concealed beneath the trees. The operation was designed not only to eliminate thousands of prisoners, but also to erase all trace of what had happened. Back in occupied Poland, families waited for letters that never arrived. Weeks became months. Months became years. No official explanation came from Soviet authorities. To relatives, it seemed as though thousands of men had simply disappeared. By May 1940, the executions were complete. Nearly 22,000 Polish officers, police officials, and members of the country's educated leadership had vanished into forests and unmarked graves. For the Soviet government, the operation appeared to have achieved its objective. The witnesses were gone. The records were sealed. The graves were hidden. For almost 3 years, the outside world knew nothing about the fate of the missing prisoners. Then, in the spring of 1943, the course of the war brought German forces to a forest near Smolensk. What they uncovered beneath the pine trees would ignite one of the greatest historical controversies of the Second World War. For nearly 3 years, the mass graves remained hidden beneath the Katyn forest. The war continued to reshape Europe. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, turning former allies into bitter enemies. As fighting swept across Western Russia, the forests around Smolensk became another battlefield, concealing a secret that neither side expected to become public. Then, in the spring of 1943, German soldiers working near the Katyn forest uncovered human remains. As excavation continued, it became clear they had discovered far more than isolated graves. Thousands of bodies lay buried in carefully prepared trenches. Many still wore Polish military uniforms. Investigators recovered identity papers, diaries, letters, newspapers, medals, and personal belongings from the victims. These items provided valuable clues about when the men had last been alive. According to the evidence examined at the site, many of the documents dated to the spring of 1940, with few personal effects from later periods. The discovery immediately became international news. For Nazi Germany, it presented a powerful propaganda opportunity. Berlin announced that the Soviet Union had murdered the prisoners and invited journalists, doctors, and an international forensic commission to examine the graves. Germany hoped the discovery would damage the alliance between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The Soviet government responded with an entirely different account. Moscow rejected the German findings and claimed that the Polish officers had remained alive until German forces occupied the area in 1941. According to the Soviet version, it was Nazi Germany, not the Soviet Union, that had carried out the executions. The world was suddenly faced with two completely different explanations. Both came from governments deeply involved in the largest war in history. Both accused the other of committing the crime, and both insisted the evidence supported their case. For many observers, determining the truth seemed almost impossible. One government refused to accept either version without an independent investigation. The Polish government in exile, based in London, asked the International Committee of the Red Cross to investigate the massacre. Rather than accepting the request, Joseph Stalin accused the Polish government of cooperating with German propaganda. In April 1943, the Soviet Union broke diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile. The discovery at Katyn had become more than a criminal investigation. It had become an international political crisis. The graves had been uncovered. The victims had finally been found. But the greatest battle was no longer over the dead. It was over the truth. By 1943, the evidence recovered from the graves had raised profound questions. Yet those questions collided with the harsh realities of a world still at war. Britain and the United States depended on the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. Publicly accusing Joseph Stalin of ordering the massacre could threaten one of the most important military alliances in history. For the families of the victims, hope had finally become certainty. Their loved ones were dead. But who would be held responsible? Would the truth be acknowledged? Or would politics bury it once again? The answers would not come quickly. Instead, the story of Katyn entered an entirely new chapter. One of diplomatic silence, conflicting investigations, Cold War politics, secret archives, and a cover-up that would last nearly half a century. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union would hidden documents finally emerge, revealing decisions that had been concealed since 1940. The massacre was over. The fight for the truth had only just begun. In Episode 2, we'll uncover how one of the greatest historical controversies of the Second World War became one of history's longest-running political cover-ups, and how the truth finally emerged after nearly 50 years.